Alright guys, welcome back to the channel. It's Matty here, and welcome back to Meta Monday, the weekly series where we analyze the Pokemon TCG Pocket metagame and keep you guys up to date on everything that's going on in the competitive world of Pokemon TCG Pocket. So this week is a big one actually. It's the second week of the Celestial Guardians format. Last week was really exciting. It was the first week, it was the new meta, and a lot of things sort of came to light. But this week there's a lot of changes and a lot of surprises that I think are going to be really interesting to take a look at today. So let's dive right into it. I'm actually really excited. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe. Before we get into it, I am going to let you guys know that literally 80% of you guys that watch all of my videos aren't even subscribed to the channel, so I would highly recommend that you guys hit that subscribe button. It supports me and the channel a lot, and I would really appreciate it. All right, so this weekend is actually a little bit different. This is one of those special weekends where we didn't just have one, large Ursa Days Pocket Weekly tournament, and we did, but we had another tournament. We actually had the $1,000 Godzly tournament, which had also about 900 players in it. So almost 2,000 people competed this weekend, which is really cool. So first thing that we're going to do is immediately take a look at the Ursa Days tournament, and then we're going to go ahead and take a look at the Godzly tournament, which also had very different results, but definitely should be really interesting to take a look at. So let's just dive right in, guys. Let's take a look. So this was the final standings of this week's Ursa Days Pocket Weekly. And as we see here, Giratina and Greninja not only got first place, but it got 4th, 5th, and 6th place, doing really well this week. The other deck list that really appeared high in the standings here is actually Crobat and Arceus. So we see Crobat and Arceus got to finals here. Ray, 92 from France here, getting 2nd place, but also 8th, 9th, and 10th place. And then everywhere in between is basically just going to be Giratina and Darkrai. We see one in 3rd place, 11th and 12th place, and then we have some other sort of off decks a little bit less commonly played decks that kind of also did well and appeared higher up on the standings. Garchomp Rampardos is one. There's Magnezone and Oricorio, and then also the Aerodactyl Rampardos variant, which is pretty interesting as well. And if we go down, we see a lot more Giratina Darkrai, some more Greninja, some more, Garchomps, and then we actually see one Fire deck here at 24th place. And we see one Solgaleo here at 30th place, and one Meowscarada as well at 34th place. But anyway, let's take a look at the deck list. So in previous weeks, Limitless has categorized Giratina and Greninja as a very specific deck that plays Greninja, Giratina, and then of course also plays things like Oricorio, more often than not. However, we're going to see something a little bit different this week, something that I actually think is quite interesting. Let's take a look at the #1 first placing deck list of this week's tournament, and it is actually going to be something a little bit different, and that is actually Greninja, Giratina, and with Tapu Lele. You might be wondering, Tapu Lele, what's going on here? Typically, we see things like Snorlax or Oricorio paired with this Greninja and Giratina EX combination. This week, this is sort of the big emergence. So this Tapu Lele deck thrown in with the Greninja Giratina combination really kind of took the meta by storm, getting first place at this week's Ursa Days tournament, which is definitely really interesting to see. This deck list is phenomenal. Let's spend some time talking about it. It did get first place in this week's tournament. Now, one thing, again, before we just dive in, is I will just talk quickly about how Limitless categorizes these Giratina and Greninja decks. For whatever the reason, Limitless right now hasn't updated, or it hasn't been changed to modify what the archetype shows as, depending on what's in the deck list. So basically, every single deck that's playing either Giratina and Greninja combined is kind of categorized under this one category, even though it might be playing Oricorio, it might be playing, Tapu Lele, as we've seen. So unfortunately, we don't have like the specific metadata for both of those different archetypes. They're all kind of bundled into one, but hopefully that gets updated. But anyway, let's take a look here at this deck list with Tapu Lele. Now, this deck list is running, by the way, just Psychic Energies, which is really cool. So basically, Tapu Lele is acting right now as kind of a replacement for Snorlax, in the way that the Snorlax, Greninja, and Giratina deck was sort of positioned in the metagame, which was a, Giratina, Greninja deck that was similar to Oricorio. However, it was worse against Giratina and Darkrai, but it was better against Oricorio. So it was sort of a counter to the counter meta. Snorlax won last week, kind of basically because of that fact, because it was, a solid deck list overall, but instead of being really good against Giratina and Darkrai, it was good against Oricorio, and Oricorio kind of farmed Giratina, Darkrai in last week's day 2, and then Snorlax capitalized on it. I think Tapu Lele kind of sits very similarly in the metagame. This deck, again, running only Psychic Energies, and instead of Oricorio or Snorlax, we're running Tapu Lele. Now, Tapu Lele has the Energy Arrow attack. For 1 Psychic Energy, we do 20 damage to any one of our opponent's Pokemon, for every energy that's attached to that Pokemon. So we can do 20 to a bench Pokemon, or the active Pokemon if it has 1 energies, or let's say we are going up against, a Giratina deck and they have 4 energies on their bench Giratina, we can hit that Giratina for 80 damage on the bench, which is really relevant. The combination of Tapu Lele and Greninja allows us to do damage to whichever Pokemon we want on our opponent's board, and then we can bring that Pokemon in with Cyrus and then, set up Giratina and take KOs. That's really where this deck kind of comes in handy. Now, because we're running Psychic Energies in this deck list, and we saw this a little bit last format in the Mewtwo Giratina deck, is that Giratina EX oftentimes finds its way into deck lists that aren't actually running Psychic Energies, predominantly because Giratina can create its own Psychic Energies with that Broken Space Bellow ability. However, when you do play Giratina in a deck that is playing Psychic Energies in your energy zone, that allows you to go 2 energies per turn on Giratina and effectively get this thing set up in 2 turns and attack on your 3rd turn, whether you're going 1st or 2nd, and that's really, really strong. Greninja EX isn't really here to be an attacker, it's really just here to, again, do damage and put pressure on the bench, and then set up some combinations with Cyrus to then KO our opponent. Tapu Lele kind of functions the same way, but instead of, Snorlax being that leadoff option with a ton of HP, or Oricorio being that leadoff option that is immune to EX Pokemon, Tapu Lele isn't really a great wall by any stretch of the imagination, but it's just a Pokemon that we can kind of have in the active spot that's not a Froakie or a Giratina, and we don't have to do anything with it. Basically, I think for most of the matchups, we're going to spend our games basically doubling up on Giratina, getting Giratina EX fully set up on the bench, hopefully evolving into our Greninja on the bench, and then once Giratina gets set up in those 2 turns, then we can just, attach to Tapu Lele and start whittling down our opponents and picking which ones we want to target. This list is actually really effective against Oricorio because, of course, Tapu Lele is still able to damage Oricorios, and they are going to have 2 energies, so we can do damage to them, but we can basically do damage to our opponent's bench Giratina and then bring it up with Cyrus, or basically just kind of force and pressure our opponent and take KOs with Tapu Lele. So that's sort of the idea, I think, with this deck, is that because we're running Psychic Energies, we can kind of immediately set up Giratina on our bench and then get it ready and primed and ready. Maybe we attach that Giant Cape to it. Maybe we kind of keep it at high HP with Pokemon Center Lady if we are getting targeted with Greninja. And it really kind of comes down to, do we draw out our Cyruses, and can we kind of KO our opponent's Giratina EX with a Giant Cape on our Giratina? And then there's nothing that can really revenge KO us. So we're kind of in a position to where, we're taking that first KO with Giratina, and then, we're still at 150 HP if we have Giant Cape attached, and then we can just kind of keep KOing and then clean up any KOs that we didn't finish off with Giratina with Tapu Lele, because we can attack for only 1 energy. It's a really, really strong deck list. So this is a really great middle ground, and I think a big reason why Tapu Lele has done so well, at least in the tournament this week, is because it is that combination of Giratina and Greninja, which of course can win games on its own right. However, it's really flexible because now we can play Psychic Energies, and we have good to great matchups realistically against Giratina Darkrai, and of course against like the Oricorio decks with Greninja and Giratina. So it kind of is settling itself into a nice spot in the metagame, very similarly to how Snorlax was positioned in the metagame. However, we now have a much better matchup against both Oricorio and Giratina Darkrai, which is really, really strong. Now you might be thinking, okay, so, we're playing only Psychic Pokemon. How are we good against Giratina Darkrai? The whole idea with it is, again, we can double up on Giratina, get it set up, and then as long as we, have that extra turn to attach to Tapu Lele and then, target down our opponent's bench Giratina, they can only set up 1 Darkrai and 1 Giratina at one time. So whether Giratina's in the active or Darkrai's in the active, as long as we draw into that Cyrus by turn 4 or 5 or whatever it is, then we can just sort of Cyrus up their Giratina, KO it, and then their opponent's Darkrai can't actually revenge KO us. No matter what, right? Because they just don't do enough damage with just Darkrai. So Greninja here allows us to basically, take that first KO and then KO whatever comes up next to it, because we're doing 150 combined with Greninja and Giratina. And even if we can't take the KO, like I said, Tapu Lele can finish it off after Giratina goes down. So the matchup against Giratina Darkrai is actually really good. Of course, if you don't get your Greninja evolved, or you don't get your Giratina on your board in a couple of turns, you're certainly going to struggle, but Tapu Lele can actually carry in its own right. You can, again, put pressure on that bench and force kind of a KO with Tapu Lele even without setting up Giratina. So this is a very effective deck list against Darkrai Giratina, which I think is important because a lot of people are still playing it. We'll take a look at the metagame soon. But anyway, very, very interesting deck here. I think that Tapu Lele is probably going to take the place of Snorlax. Now, in the matchup against Oricorio, we should technically be favored, but of course, it really still comes down to who gets their Giratinas and their Greninja set up. So it's a little bit of RNG to even in that particular matchup as to who wins or not, but it should be somewhat favored for Tapu Lele. And then also the mirror matchup is something I want to talk about. This is a deck list that, to be fair, is really, really good in tournaments because of its position against those 2 decks at the very top of the metagame. But you need to keep in mind that if everyone starts to play Tapu Lele, the mirror match is absolutely dreadful. Pokemon Pocket is kind of famous for having some very annoying and terrible mirror matches, but basically if you're going against an opponent that's playing the same deck you are, if you're playing this Tapu Lele deck, it is probably the most degenerate, just absolutely ridiculous mirror match of all time, because again, Tapu Lele can put pressure, and of course, you only do damage based off of, whoever, whatever Pokemon have energies on them on your opponent's board. So in the mirror matchup, you can just not, go with Giratina, you can just not attach energies, and then you can just sort of rely on having whoever gets Greninja out earlier, and then just sort of go Tapu Lele for Tapu Lele. It's a really interesting matchup, but it is kind of degenerate, and it really just comes down to whoever gets their Greninjas out early enough or who draws their Cyruses. It's a really, really funny deck, but it's actually pretty well positioned, so I'm actually not super surprised that it got first place this week. Again, Snorlax got first place last week, I think for very similar reasons, predominantly because we're kind of a counter to the counter meta, right? Which is definitely really, really good, but I think now having also a good matchup against Giratina, Darkrai, and the Oricorio decks, it definitely positions Lele to a really, really good degree. Now, I will say, if you're curious what is good against this deck list, there's two things in particular I think that are really, really good against this Tapu Lele deck that definitely can keep it in check. Things that are commonly played that are good against this, I would say, are probably Garchomp, Rampardos. Garchomp can damage the bench, it also plays Cyrus, but also it doesn't require a lot of energies to use their attacks. Both Rampardos and Garchomp can use pretty effective attacks for only one energy, so that kind of shuts off Tapu Lele. We're also playing Lily to keep us at high HP, so that Giratina can't KO us, and then of course, we're playing Cyrus and we're playing all that good stuff. Things like Meowscarada are also really good against this deck. Meowscarada in general is just good against really any Giratina deck, but since they can attack with Greninja, they can only do 40 damage to a Meowscarada. We're running Leaf Capes, we're running, Ericas, so Meowscarada and then Decidueye should have a really good matchup against this deck as well. And then Solgaleo, actually. So if this does end up being sort of the next big thing in the metagame, Solgaleo does actually have a little bit of a spot. Being a metal type, Tapu Lele is not actually weak to dark. It's weak to metal, which is interesting. So Giant Cape Tapu Lele actually lives an attack from Darkrai, which is funny. But realistically, we're weak to metal, so the Skarmory decks and the Solgaleo decks should be really good against this particular matchup as well. So keep that in mind. Also, that deck has Pokemon that attack for little energy. So Solgaleo definitely strong in this matchup as well. That might open up some pathways for Solgaleo to be a little bit more relevant in the metagame, which would be cool because that is definitely a fun deck list. Now let's take a look here at the second place deck of this tournament, which is going to be Arceus, Carnivine, and Crobat. I've talked about this deck a little bit as the weeks have gone on. It's definitely a really major player in the metagame. This is sort of like high roll. Like this is a very, very like RNG based sort of high roll deck. It's a really good deck list, but it's super reliant on drawing the cards in the correct order. So a deck list like this is something that I'm expecting to see placing well in tournaments pretty regularly, because if enough people play this deck list, then enough people are going to get lucky in the sort of sequencing of which they draw the cards in this deck. If you lead with Carnivine, if you bench the Zubat and you bench that Arceus early, you can put great pressure on. We have good matchups against Oricorio, but we're just in general doing enough damage to where we should be strong against most things in the format. Interestingly enough, this deck list actually struggles against Garchomp as long as you're not playing the Fighting Gible. You're playing the Dragon type Gible, so you're not getting 1-hit KO'd by Carnivine. Garchomp in general hitting for weakness on both Arceus and Crobat while being able to damage the bench. Rampardos as well, being able to 1-hit KO Arceus and Crobat is definitely really relevant. So Rampardos Garchomp is actually really, really good, I would say, into Arceus, but really any of the Rampardos decks should be very effective. And also, to be fair, this is a deck list that kind of loses to itself most of the time, and it probably will struggle against Meowscarada as well. So the grass decks, which we talked about in last week's best decks video for ranked mode, talked quite a bit about Meowscarada and Decidueye because I think it's actually very well positioned in the current metagame, which I think is actually really, really important when you consider what decks are going to be more relevant now as time goes on. I will say that Tapu Lele here is probably really good against fire decks as well, for the similar reason that they just pile up energies, and Tapu Lele plus Greninja can do a lot of damage to some of those fire decks, so that's sort of something to keep in mind. We should also have a good fire matchup in this particular deck, just like Oricorio Greninja does. But anyway, that's Arceus and Crobat getting second place. No surprise, we also saw 3 of them right here in 8th, 9th, and 10th place. I believe these are all going to be very similar decks playing Carnivine and things like that. This one's playing Golbat, but basically the same list. This one is the same list as before, so it's kind of been figured out, at least, which way we're kind of playing Arceus and Carnivine. Again, a deck that is very dependent from an RNG perspective in, drawing the correct cards, getting the right leadoffs, getting the correct Pokemon on your bench. Very reliant on all of that stuff, but if it does flow the way it should flow, this deck is absolutely incredible. There's really not much that can beat this deck. The pressure between the 50 damage from Carnivine and the 30 damage from Crobat Crobat is really, really strong for 1 energy. On your second turn, potentially doing 80 damage with this combination is absolutely crazy. So again, it's a little bit awkward in terms of all of the cards that you need to get in the correct order, but if you do get all of those cards, it probably is going to win most matchups in the game. So the only struggle for that deck is kind of its consistency. And here at third place, we do, of course, have Giratina Darkrai. It wouldn't be a tournament here in Pokemon Pocket if we didn't see a high placing Giratina Darkrai deck. It was, I think, the most played deck of this week, so it's really no surprise for me that we saw at least one get pretty high ranking here in third place. And we all know what Giratina Darkrai does. Unfortunately, I think now, or fortunately for us, I think that Giratina Darkrai has a lot of counterplay that's seeing play in the metagame. Of course, Oricorio is still popular, but Tapu Lele is running around now. And then, of course, the grass decks are becoming increasingly more popular, which I think is really relevant. Luckily, people have sort of moved off of the fire decks, and people have moved off of the Solgaleo decks. Now, increasing the amount of decks that are being played in the metagame that are strong against Giratina Darkrai, which is what I think we kind of all want, is for Giratina Darkrai not to be sort of the runaway favorite. So now I think there's at least like 4 or 5 decks that are all really relevant in the metagame, which I think are going to be really important to keep Giratina Darkrai in check, because we really don't want this thing running around. But anyway, this is this list. We're playing red, Sabrina, Cyrus, Mars, red card. What you're going to often see is 1 Mars, 1 red card in a lot of these Giratina Darkrai decks, and we're actually going to see that Mars red card combination in a lot of decks. It's just really strong. Hand Disruption is really relevant, especially in all of these rare candy decks. Even the decks that aren't really using stage 2 attacking Pokemon are still playing stage 2 Pokemon. Things like Greninja, things like Crobat. The Hand Disruption is really, really good to slow down those decks, especially if they get an early Professor's Research out. It's really the only counterplay we have for them to not just pop off on their first couple of turns, and I think that's really relevant. Now, at 4th place here, like I said, we also have Giratina and Greninja. This player here, but as we'll see, he's actually not playing Tapu Lele. It's categorized the same on Limitless. I just talked about that, but this is the Oricorio version with Shaman. This is an incredibly good deck list, basically an auto win against Giratina Darkrai, but we are still playing Giratina and Greninja. We should potentially be able to beat basically every deck in the game. And I'm not going to say that Tapu Lele has like a phenomenal matchup against Oricorio. I do think it's probably favored in Tapu Lele's favor, but again, if we are going second and we are able to get Greninja out early enough, we should be able to beat really any deck in the game, and Shaman does negate some of that damage from Tapu Lele, and we do play Iridas and Giant Cape. So there's a lot of relevancy into this deck list and how it's built. And this list here, I think, is still something that's at the top of the metagame. Really, really good against Giratina Darkrai, but should still be able to win against most things in the format for sure. We can't struggle against some of those Rampardos decks if they get those decks out early. But realistically, we have the potential to beat anything in the game with this particular deck list as well. So no surprise that it got top 4 as well. Let's take a look at the 5th place deck. This is also going to be Tapu Lele. I think basically very, very similar. This player is actually playing 1 X Speed and 1 Pokemon Center Lady, so it's a little bit different. No Hand Disruption here, but we are still playing, of course, 2 Cyrus. Now, one thing I will say is that we're playing 1 Frogadier in this list, and I know some people play the 1 Stage 1 Evolution here, the 1 Frogadier in their deck list. It's kind of up in the air. Again, we're playing Psychic Energies in this deck. I don't believe that playing the middle evolution is worth it. It's just another card in your deck that oftentimes isn't really providing any value. I don't think that it's really worth playing, especially since like we're running 2 Greninja, 2 Rare Candy anyway, and Tapu Lele's kind of that leadoff Pokemon. So you're just kind of increasing the amount of Pokemon in your deck that aren't super relevant. So the data does show us that if you are playing Frogadier in your deck, you're actually winning a little bit less than if you're not. So I know some people are kind of up in the air. Some people like to play the middle evolution, but realistically, I think the data shows that just not playing Frogadier and maybe playing just some other card in place of it should make your deck theoretically better. I think there's just better options than playing that middle evolution. But anyway, that is the 5th place Giratina Greninja deck. Again, they're all categorized the same, but they're different decks. And then here at, what is the 6th place, we have another Oricorio deck. So 6 of the top, or I guess 4 of the top 6 decks were Giratina and Greninja. 2 of them Tapu Lele, 2 of them were Oricorio. Now, the way that it works in tournaments is people see the deck that gets first place, and then they're going to end up playing that deck. It's what we saw with Snorlax last week. Truthfully, like, tournaments don't show, like, you shouldn't put that much weight in a deck getting first place as opposed to a deck getting second or third place. It basically just means that they got a little bit luckier in their matchups in Top Cut. You know, things kind of went their way a little bit. The difference between you getting second place and first place in a tournament, of course, the rewards are probably different, but realistically, what we're seeing here is that, yes, Tapu Lele got first, but what we're still seeing, if we go back to the standings, if it's going to let us, can we go back to the standings, please? what we see realistically is that Tapu Lele getting first place, but 2 Oricorio and Greninja decks are in the top 6. So to me, that kind of says enough. And then, of course, Giratina Darkrai still being relevant. So what I would expect, truthfully, because it's just the way that tournaments go, that we're going to see a lot of people either next week in the tournaments or in ranked battles right now playing a lot of Tapu Lele just because it did get first place at this week's Ursa Days tournament. So it's going to see a lot more play now, for sure. It's kind of taking the metagame by storm. Again, going to really open up the pathways for some of these fighting decks like Garchomp, Rampardos, but also the grass decks like Meowscarada and Decidueye to be really even better now in the metagame. Again, decks that are really good against all of these Giratina Greninja decks, which are pretty relevant for sure. And then, of course, Arceus and Crobat is kind of that weird, kind of like extra thing kind of thrown in there to kind of spice things up a little bit. But if we go down here, let's scroll down and take a look at the highest placing Garchomp deck of this tournament. And this is pretty standard. 2 Lily, 1 Cyrus in here, 1 Iono. Now for me, I personally do not play Iono in my Garchomp deck. I know a lot of people say that you use it to grab your fossils, but realistically, if you're relying on Iono to grab your fossil, then you're probably not going to get your, your Rampardos out early enough. It just doesn't, Iono is not a bad card by any means, but I do kind of feel like I would rather play a second Cyrus in here than Iono. So I understand people like Iono, and I think it's definitely not a bad card. I'm sure it's providing some value in the deck. I'm just not someone that's like particularly big fan of Iono. Oftentimes, you're just sort of giving your opponent a better hand as well, and you're not guaranteeing anything off Iono either. You can draw the exact same cards off of it, and you're going -1 card value. So there are definitely scenarios where Iono is super useful, and it does, end up kind of helping you win the game, but it doesn't always do that. It's kind of an inconsistent card. But anyway, that's my opinion. This is Garchomp here. Really, really good. I think 1 Cape, 2 Lily is really, really good. I think that it's probably correct. And again, 1 Iono, 1 Cyrus, but I do like playing 2 Cyrus in Garchomp because it is oftentimes a win condition when I'm playing Garchomp. So having 2 copies of Cyrus gives me more of an opportunity to draw into the Cyrus. Not that we need 2 in a game, but we just need at least that first one in a timely manner. So playing 2 Cyrus does definitely give us that available Cyrus a little bit more oftentimes. But anyway, that's Garchomp. And like I said, I put Garchomp in the S tier of last week's tier list, and it might still be S tier. Like I said, great against Tapu Lele, it's good against Oricorio, and it is also really good against Arceus and Crobat. If we take a look here, were we playing Dragon Gibble in this list? We are. Okay, so the correct Gibble is this Dragon one, not the Fighting one, because Carnivine is certainly really, really common in the format. You don't really benefit at all by playing the Fighting Gibble. Snorlax is less common in the format, but also like that extra damage on Oricorio is really not relevant either. So yeah, anyway, don't play the Fighting Gibble, play the Dragon Gibble for sure. I would highly, highly recommend it. If we go down here, we have another Oricorio deck. So again, the most common deck here in Top Cut in terms of Greninja and Giratina was Oricorio. It wasn't necessarily Tapu Lele, even though a couple of Tapu Lele decks did do really well and made it really far into the bracket. In general, I think that Oricorio is still probably the more common version of it. Totally fine, totally cool. And then at 15th place, we have Magnezone and Oricorio. This is a deck list as well that does do good against Tapu Lele. So again, it's sort of another, just sort of a not like super top of the meta deck, but a really, really good deck that also might kind of find its niche in the metagame doing well against Tapu Lele, which I think is pretty relevant. Magnezone in general is just a really, really strong card. Being able to KO Greninjas and Tapu Lele is certainly really, really good. Oricorio is immune to Giratina. So I really like this list. I think that it's still really good. I know everybody's really high on the Greninja and Giratina combinations, but this is still a really good way to play Oricorio. It's definitely still a proper deck list. Let's take a look here at this Rampardos or a Dactyl Fossil deck, which is actually just playing 1 copy of Rockruff Lycanroc, and it is the only basic Pokemon in the deck, so we're only running 1 copy of it, and we have Signs of Evolution to find our Lycanroc. So kind of makes sense here. I kind of like it, pulling 4 total fossils. We can go into Aerodactyl, we can go into Rampardos, so instead of Garchomp, Aerodactyl is that EX Pokemon, but basically just sort of always having Rockruff is definitely an advantage, and Lycanroc, again, is actually well positioned. It's a little bit awkward against Tapu Lele because we're only hitting for 50 against it because it's got less HP than 100, right? So it's kind of a little bit awkward, but realistically, we should at least be pretty good against Oricorio and Tapu Lele. I like Lycanroc actually in the format. I really, really do. It's necessarily not as good because Snorlax isn't as common, but it's certainly a really, really good card. So yeah, I like this list. And again, fighting in general, I think is really, really good. And we're probably going to see it a little bit more often as time goes on. Here at 24th place, we have at least 1 Charizard in here. I've been talking down a little bit about the fire decks. I just don't think they're as well positioned in the metagame, especially now with all of the Oricorio, Greninja, Giratina decks with Tapu Lele now. I just don't really see this deck doing that well. If it had like a phenomenal matchup against Giratina Darkrai, I could see like the justification for playing it, but our matchup against Giratina Darkrai is just a little bit above 50%. Like it's basically a 50-50 matchup, so I don't really think that Charizard is that good good. Also, like going against the grass decks, like you are of course favored, but if the grass decks are going second, and they get like the double Meowscarada out early, like you just lose because unfortunately if you're going second, Charizard doesn't attack until turn 3, so unfortunately your opponent is going to be able to attack you a couple times, and then you're reliant on that second Pokemon getting set up. So the matchup against Grass isn't even as good as it probably should be, which is kind of funny. I beat the Fire decks all the time when I'm playing Meowscarada and Decidueye, which is probably a coincidence, but pretty funny nonetheless. But anyway, here at 30th place, we also have this is the highest placing Solgaleo deck, and like I said, I don't think that Solgaleo is really going to take over the format. I don't think it's going to really find its space, at the top of the metagame, but it is a deck list that is a really good counter to Tapu Lele. So if you do end up playing a bunch of Tapu Leles, or if they just end up being the most common deck, then Solgaleo certainly could have a chance to interject itself a little bit higher back up into the metagame. Unfortunately, this deck list just isn't that great against a lot of the other decks in the format, and it is certainly a little bit disappointing. But Solgaleo is certainly a good card, and it is certainly really good in a couple of matchups, Tapu Lele being one of them. That's pretty relevant. This Solgaleo here, playing Lilies, we're playing Iono, Sabrina, Cyrus, all of the stuff that we would typically play in our deck. No hand disruption, which is definitely interesting. This is a deck that definitely struggles against hand disruption. A lot of the decks do, to be fair, so that's not like too big of a point. And if we go down here, we see some Decidueye and Meowscarada. This is the highest placing Decidueye Meowscarada deck here at 34th place. So not like super high ranking, but a lot of people probably weren't playing Grass. It's just not very common in the metagame, at least right now. But this deck list is actually really good. It's been doing really good for me in Master Ball rank as well. I rattled off like a 9-game win streak with it the other day, and I played it on stream last night as well, and we actually did fairly well with this list as well. So it's just good against a lot of the common decks in the format. There's a lot of those Giratina and Greninja decks. There's a lot of Giratina Darkrai. There's a lot of ground type decks, and all of those are matchups that realistically we should be favored in. So I actually, as time goes on, am liking the positioning here of Meowscarada and Decidueye even more as time goes on. This list is a little bit interesting. The main downside to this deck is that, of course, when we aren't going second, we're kind of a turn behind at all times. Also, very, very, I guess, weak to like hand disruption, right? Like after we go and play a research and then we cry for help and we have all of our cards in our hand and we're ready to pop off, our opponent's going to hit us with a Mars or a red card, and then we go back to stage 1, and then realistically we're massively set back at that point. So this deck list is really funny because we are actually playing hand disruption in our own right. We're playing 1 red card. This list is playing 2 Ericas. You could play 1 Erica and then you could play Mars and red card. I've seen people do that. That's the list that I was playing on stream. I actually do think 2 Ericas is probably correct in here, and I like Sabrina. So that's the thing with this deck, is that like hand disruption in this list is actually really good because sometimes we're going first, and realistically we're at a disadvantage if we go first. So playing hand disruption in this deck list is kind of funny because we're weak to hand disruption, so it's sort of a counter to the counter for this deck list. But no, I do think Grass is really, really well positioned. I think for whatever the reason, a lot of people are just choosing not to play Grass. It's certainly not one of the most common decks in the format, which is a bit unfortunate, but I do actually think that Grass is very, very well positioned. I think it probably has the potential to be extremely relevant in the metagame. If we go down here, we're probably going to see some other niche stuff here. There was a Banette deck, a couple of them actually, that made day 2, which is pretty funny. And this is actually also going to be incorporating Tapu Lele. And this actually isn't playing Mewtwo. We're playing Mew-EX and we're playing Arceus, which are fairly effective attacking options for colorless energy, which is pretty cool. Mew-EX is going to be good against Giratinas, and it's just relevant in general. So I actually like this deck list. I kind of do. Banette's a lot better than people give it credit for. Again, kind of a niche option in the metagame, but Banette is a lot better than I think some people give it credit for. I really, really like this list, and I lose to it all the time because Banette with Team Rocket Grunt can actually take 2 free KOs, which is crazy to think about. You just have to get a little bit lucky with the Team Rocket Grunt. And then again, things like Tapu Lele, Mew-EX can kind of clean up, and we can go Banette into a Mew-EX or an Arceus. There's proper lines where this deck is really good. Unfortunately, Banette is a stage 1 Pokemon, so there's really no guarantee that we ever get the Banette out, and that's kind of a downside to the deck. Also, like starting Arceus in Mew-EX probably doesn't feel like super great. So there's a lot of inconsistencies to this deck, but if you wanted to play something that was off meta but still really good, I actually think that Banette might be one of the best options for you. This is a list a little bit different, playing Oricorio and Mewtwo. Mewtwo really, really strong, of course, for sure. Banette allows us to kind of slowly set up Mewtwo, and then we have Red to take a KO. It's good. It's a really strong deck. I love Banette. I see it sometimes in Master Ball rank, not very often to be fair, but as far as like off meta, sort of like counter meta or anti-meta decks go, this is certainly a really, really good option. In fact, it's kind of like the next best option of things that aren't like really in the metagame, which is kind of funny. Let's take a look here at this Solgaleo deck real quick that is playing Kangaskhan, which is kind of funny. So instead of Skarmory, we're playing Kangaskhan because we have Lima. So Lima, Kangaskhan, it's a pretty fun lead. I actually quite like it. I think that there's a lot of potential between things like Kangaskhan. You could even play Kangaskhan in an Arceus Crobat deck with Lima. There's a lot of potential to, I think, like the Lima and some of the colorless cards in the format. I think that it's actually a pretty soundproof strategy. I think it's actually really cool. So that's an interesting deck list. And then down here at 55th place, we actually did also have a Lunala deck, which unfortunately Lunala just hasn't had its opportunity to shine. I do think that this list has potential. I just think that unfortunately with Oricorio right now, it kind of makes us a bit reliant on playing these like, you know, this Levitate Giratina and the Necrozma, which realistically aren't great cards, but you kind of have to run them or else you get just absolutely bodied, unfortunately, by things like Oricorio. So maybe this deck list will get a little bit better as time goes on and Psychic gets a little bit more well-positioned, or a deck like this gets more well-positioned. The real only downside to this list is that Lunala EX does 100 damage, so a lot of these stage 2 Pokemon are playing Lily, so we're not even 2-KOing some of these like Charizards or Garchomps that are playing Lily, and that's definitely kind of a downside. 100 damage is definitely a bit weak for 3 energies with Lunala, even though its effect is really, really strong, and it pairs well with Giratina. So that's the standings of the Ursa Days tournament this week. Let's quickly take a look at the metagame tab, and we'll get a little bit of justification. Okay, so what's funny here, and I'm just going to immediately say this, Snorlax was still the second most played deck of this tournament, 10% of the meta share, and we saw literally 0 Snorlax. We saw literally none in any of those standings. So unfortunately, again, I think that a lot of people played Snorlax because it won last week, but the meta has changed and things have shifted. Snorlax realistically just isn't a great option. I know it won last week and a lot of people played it, but realistically it's bad against Giratina Darkrai, and it loses against a lot of things in the format. It's just not a great deck, even though it is a great counterplay to Oricorio. I just don't think that it's a good option, especially now with Tapu Lele being a lot more effective in that matchup than Snorlax is. So like realistically, I think Tapu Lele has just taken over for Snorlax, but unfortunately Limitless doesn't categorize any of these decks separately, like Lele and Oricorio. So everything Giratina and Greninja is split up into just sort of one combo here, which is why we see it here in just one category. But also if we go down, we see that there's a Greninja and Giratina deck. Now, the reason why it's split up into two is because basically Limitless categorizes the deck differently if we are playing Frogadier in our deck. So Limitless just is kind of struggling right now categorizing all of these Giratina and Greninja decks. But basically, if you combine this right here, 81, and the 27 here, you'll see that this was actually the second most played archetype of the format. However, somewhere along those lines, that particular archetype is split once again between Oricorio and Tapu Lele. So hopefully Limitless changes that and we get a little bit more understanding of the data. But yes, theoretically, Greninja, Giratina decks were the second most common decks of this tournament. By far the most successful. Again, those are the best decks in the format, in my opinion, if you're not playing Giratina and Darkrai. But now I think that Giratina Darkrai is probably going to be struggling a little bit more as like the time goes on. And let's take a look quickly at the win rates because I had to zoom out so we could see it. Giratina Darkrai, still really, really high average win rate. The most played deck and probably one of the highest win rates here at 54.5%. Really, really great. Snorlax struggling tremendously at 43 or 44%. By far the lowest out of basically everything other than Charizard. So again, I'm just telling you that these decks are totally fine. Snorlax is a great deck. Charizard Incineroar is a great deck. They're just not as well positioned in the metagame right now as things are panning up. That's why they have really low win rates and high amounts of play. Solgaleo also kind of struggling here at 46%. Greninja Giratina was 55, so that was actually the highest win rate out of any of the most played decks. Kind of makes sense. That's all of the Oricorio decks, all of the Tapu Lele decks, not playing Frogadier in your list, meaning that, that's all of those decks sort of combined ended up being 55.13% win rate, the highest of the tournament. Kind of makes sense when you took a look at the standings. Giratina Darkrai doing really good. Snorlax, don't play Snorlax anymore, for sure. Like, swap the Tapu Lele or just play Giratina Greninja with something other than Snorlax, I would recommend. And then Arceus Crobat, again, very, very consistently, very, very good, 52%. It's been about 52, 53% this entire metagame, so it really is sort of that number 3 option. I just think that, again, it has its inconsistency issues, but again, it's a deck that basically beats everything if it draws properly, which is really, really strong, which is why I think we could probably see it win a tournament here pretty soon, which I think is certainly interesting. Garchomp, pretty even here at 50%. Again, Solgaleo and Charizard struggling here, 42 and then 46%. This one right here, it's a small sample size, but this list here playing Frogadier just won less games than not playing Frogadier, and it always does for some reason. This particular categorization of Greninja and Giratina always has less high win rate, so don't play Frogadier in your list is basically what it tells me. Magnezone and Oricorio actually kind of struggled. That kind of makes sense probably, considering all of the other decks that saw play like Snorlax and like Crobat. And then fighting here, Lucario and Rampardos did fairly good. Meowscarada and Decidueye also doing fairly well here, a little bit higher than 50%, which is pretty cool. Although it's split up into two archetypes here. Again, I'm not sure what the difference is, but this one was only 42%. These sample sizes are a bit small, so it's hard to categorize. I don't know exactly what's kind of making this deck list be categorized differently. Like I said, Limitless kind of struggles with categorizing the decks differently based off of like the different quantities of the evolutions. And Rare Candy has kind of made that a little bit awkward. Some decks aren't running the middle evolution, some decks are. It just changes the way that the decks are categorized, unfortunately. And if we go down here, Mewtwo Gardevoir actually doing pretty good. Small sample size, 21 and 18, but did fairly well here. Solgaleo and Snorlax definitely struggled, 9 and 25. So Snorlax in general just doesn't seem to be something that's probably worth playing right now in the metagame. And there you go. We've talked really quickly and we've said a lot of words over the last couple of minutes. But anyway, there it is. Here is sort of the metagame tab and all of the results of the Ursa Days tournament. Now what I would like to do is quickly go over and let's take a look at the Godzly tournament, which again happened to kind of at the same time this weekend. A little bit less players than the Ursa Days tournament, but basically also a 900 player tournament. Really, really cool. And these were the standings of this tournament. Quickly, let's take a look at the metagame to see if it's any different than the other tournament. And it is actually a little bit different. So Giratina, Darkrai, still the most played deck here. Really good win percentage. Snorlax, however, still the second most played deck. Of course, still not a great win percentage. But Garchomp did worse in this particular tournament. Charizard still did bad. Solgaleo did bad. And then where is it? Yeah, Giratina and Greninja, the highest win rate. So very similar, truthfully. Grass decks did really good in this tournament as well, 59%. In fact, actually kind of the highest win rates for the grass decks, which is interesting. Grass is good in the format. It's really, really good. I don't know, again, they're very, very similar. So the data differences aren't going to be that too important. And if we take a look at the standings, Giratina, Darkrai did win this Godzly tournament, and then Snorlax got second. Unfortunately, Snorlax probably kind of farmed a lot of the Oricorio decks. Maybe less people were playing Tapu Lele in this tournament, and more people were playing it in the Ursa Days tournament. Meowscarada did find its way pretty high up in the standings here at 5th place and 9th place. A couple of Greninja and Giratina decks down here, a couple of Arceus decks, and a few fighting decks, a few fire decks. So really, really similar, but it's interesting to see that two big tournaments happened at the same time. Tapu Lele and Greninja and Giratina won the Ursa Days tournament, and Darkrai Giratina won the Godzly tournament, which is kind of interesting. It's kind of fun to see, which decks win which weeks, but I think it's definitely apparent to us, especially with two tournaments this weekend, what decks were really at the top of the metagame. Again, Tapu Lele really kind of taking things by storm. The highest placing deck list for Greninja and Giratina was actually not playing Tapu Lele. It was playing Oricorio. So this list was also playing Oricorio, and then the 8th place list was also playing Oricorio. So maybe just less people played Tapu Lele in this tournament. There's one here at 10 and 3. So where was it? On 12th place was playing Tapu Lele in their Greninja Giratina deck, and then this player was as well. So in this tournament, the Oricorio decks did better than the Tapu Lele decks. And then in Ursa Days, it was kind of the opposite. In day 2, Tapu Lele did better than the Oricorio decks. But anyway, that's kind of it. That's sort of what the metagame looks like right now, guys. And hopefully you guys find it somewhat interesting. I think that it's interesting. Like, we're in a very strange spot in the metagame. Again, I think we would have a lot more better data categorization if these Giratina and Greninja decks were categorized properly on Limitless. I think that's really sort of the big downside right now. I've had to basically playtest Tapu Lele a bunch myself to know exactly where it's good, how to play it, and then, what its matchups look like, because again, we just don't really have that data on Limitless right now. But like I said, Tapu Lele really, really strong. I think it's strong in the sense that it's kind of just taken the place of Snorlax because it operates a very similar function, but it's just has a better matchup spread against the other common decks in the format. So we have a really good matchup against Giratina Darkrai still, but what we have is still a really good also matchup against Oricorio. So this is sort of the big story of this week is Tapu Lele. Tapu Lele is taken over. Snorlax is on the out. I really expect to see, excuse me. I really expect to see very little Snorlax as the weeks go on. And I expect to see a lot more Tapu Lele, which again will open up the path for these fighting decks to still be really relevant, which they were last week with Oricorio being relevant, but also I think we're going to expect to see Grass also be pretty relevant. So Fire on the down, Solgaleo may be on the up, but it didn't do really good this week, so Solgaleo is probably not something we're going to consider playing. I would probably not recommend it, but Grass and Ground definitely on the rise. Fire kind of on the fall. Giratina Darkrai is still Giratina Darkrai. Snorlax has been replaced by Tapu Lele, and Oricorio is still a really, really good option in the current metagame. But the one takeaway here is that Giratina EX is the best card in Pokemon Pocket still by a pretty wide margin, and I think the best pairing for it in the metagame right now is either Darkrai or Greninja. The upside to playing Greninja is that you can build your deck pretty flexibly, and you can kind of build it in a lot of different ways. So Tapu Lele, kind of the flavor of the week this week, kind of storming in its first appearance of the Ursa Days tournament. Realistically, it's kind of first showing, got first place, very similar to Snorlax last week again. So even though it's a different deck list and it's a different story this week, I think that the metagame still is kind of in the hands of the counter meta, which of course is why Snorlax won last week, but Tapu Lele won this week. So expect to see a lot of Tapu Lele on the ladder. Later this week, we'll give our best decks, our third, I guess, video, our third updated best decks for ranked battles video, which should be really interesting. We'll go a little bit more in detail. And then in tomorrow's video, where we're doing our second tier list of this metagame, we'll talk a little bit more in depth about how all of the decks interact and where I believe all of these decks kind of stand amongst each other in the metagame. I think it's going to be certainly really fun to take a look at that, guys. So stay tuned for tomorrow's video. Don't forget to like and subscribe. It should be a really, really good time. And yeah. Thank you guys so much for watching. Let's get out of here, guys. Peace out. Comment below what you think of this metagame, what you think of this particular weekend's tournaments, of the results. What do you think of the new Tapu Lele decks? What do you think about some of the decks that maybe haven't been doing well? What decks do you think that you should be playing in the metagame right now? Hopefully, all of this information is useful to you guys. Hopefully, you guys enjoyed this video. Don't forget to like and subscribe. We'll see you guys later. Peace out. Have a good one, and we'll see you guys next time. All right. Bye.